Again, thank you to the esteemed panel for helping us launch this discussion on Africa. We will take questions and answers and dialogue from the audience, but I sincerely appreciate, again, this important discussion. It is imperative that, and particularly in our department, it will be ingrained that Africa and that this text, the world in Africa, an inquiry into the part which Africa has played into world history, has got to be essential reading, because as we see, Du Bois covered geography, history, culture, and politics, centering Africa in world history, which, again, I was not being flippant with my Michael Jackson comment for this very reason. When I started college at the age of 25, I went to St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The great books curriculum. So we read Herodotus, the histories. We read Euclid. We learned Greek and Greek translation in order to do Euclidean math. In the first year I was there, which was actually the only year I was there, we read Herodotus, the histories. And Herodotus kept making reference to these Africans, and I got all excited. I said, oh, can we come? There's Africans here. You mean Greek civilization was not the beginning of all civilization? Because Herodotus was saying that the woolly-haired, dark-skinned people were the people who were influencing Greek civilization. Can we talk about them? I was told no. We must start with Plato and Herodotus, Herodotus as a historian, but this is text. Aristophanes, the clouds. This is text. Africa is context. That's what I was told in way of explanation of why we have to start with the understanding that Greek and Greece and Rome are the origins of all civilization. So it is not flippant to thank Michael Jackson for Remember the Time, reminding us with his culture, music, and imagery that Egypt is in Africa, and Africa is the origin of all civilization. What I would also strongly encourage folks to read, another reason these texts as central is because, again, drawing on culture, Du Bois discusses Shakespeare. And so everyone from Herodotus to Shakespeare's Othello, to Michael Jackson, everyone understands that Egypt is one part, and I'm grateful again to Dr. Scott for his linguistically helping us understand Africa as a continent, not one unified country, but as a continent with many cultures, many languages, that this is something we need to investigate. Culture through linguistics, culture through politics, through history. And again, Dr. Elonge's comment, I think, was well taken, that Du Bois was an expert in methodology. Everything that he did with an understanding and appreciation of both a scientist and an artist, which is a very rare combination. So again, I'm extremely excited and very grateful to our panel for bringing their disciplinary perspectives, their interdisciplinary perspectives to this discussion. And we will now open it up for a very short few minutes of discussion.
I just had a couple remarks based on comments that some of my established colleagues commented on. Like, for instance, when we talk about colonial education in parts of Africa, I was born in Nigeria, grew up there, lived there till I was about 14 before my family left and came to the U.S. Went to, of course, school there, which was under a British curriculum. Knew nothing about slavery, knew nothing about the slave trade. When we talk about what is African-American relation to Africa, growing up as a child in Nigeria, you weren't African-Americans. You were Black Americans. I didn't know how you got here. I thought you just left. you weren't African Americans. So as a child growing up, there was, for me, no relation of African Americans or America to Africa because it was not a part of my curriculum. The British colonized Nigeria, and of course they probably didn't want to glorify their history of their part in the slave trade and what actually had to happen for them to colonize the country. So the first time I ever heard about slavery was a little bit in my sophomore world history class here in the US about Lincoln freeing the slaves. And here I am looking stupid, what slaves? All right. I started out as a biology major as an undergrad until I took an elective in African American history. And I'm learning that there was this entire world slave system that happened. And my main question was, why don't I know this? I grew up in Africa and I don't know this. I knew that Nigeria became independent in 1960 and we celebrated Independence Day on October 1st. I didn't know what we were becoming independent from. It wasn't taught. We were taught in English. We took our own language. I took Yoruba as a foreign language in my own country. And this was in the 80s, folks. Not to tell my age. So we are not that far gone, right, from where Du Bois is saying what we want to be. You know, the last little pledge that I read, that is his dream. And unfortunately, it is still an unrealized dream, all right? We still have to make that pledge. We still have to make that demand and pretty much take back our land. Nigeria is pretty much world producing power. All is in Nigeria. We're poor, we're broke. We go all day long with no electricity. People have to have generators just to keep their food good. But we are the world's #1 producing power. We ship all our power out everywhere else. We have oil. What is wrong with that picture?
Thank you for your questions. And it is very obvious why, of course, the education you received. Most African countries were colonized by the British, the French, the Germans, the Portuguese, and the Spanish. And of course, they did in no way even teach in their curriculum about the Africans themselves in their own countries. You studied only European history. They never taught African history. Therefore, it is important for us to correct this, where we can begin to advocate that African history, African American history, becomes an integral part of the curriculum of schools in Africa. Even today, I will beg to observe that in very few colleges and universities is African American history taught. Some time ago in this great institution, it was very contentious when some of us suggested that African American history should be a core course for all students. Unfortunately, some of our colleagues differed with this. And we did not see why we should be an HBCU where students come here for their thirst of African American culture and history, why we could not at least make this a core course for all students who really come to this university. So the African educational system was so good at learning about Europe, about the United States, about other parts of the world, and nothing even about Africa itself, even about Nigeria or Cameroon or Kenya. The curriculum was silent, but this is changing. It's changing, but I hope these new courses are being taught in the right perspective.
Again, we've got just about 5 minutes, and I know some of our panelists have to leave to teach class, so don't be shy.
I had one question. From this discussion, we will move on to have a dialogue between Africa and America in terms of the history ongoing.
Yes. No, the long answer is,
how do we do it?
well, I do take Dr. Elonge's comment very seriously in terms of suggesting as part of the core curriculum African American history. But again, the African American Studies, Africana Women's Studies, and History program is a new development this year. And I think that is an incredible opportunity to increase the dialogue between Africa, African American Studies. Our core course in the history degree, because there are 3 separate degrees within one department, our core course for the history degree is USA, Africa, and the world. And that is, you know, that's something that that I inherited as chair, but that is an easy place to insert this particular text as a core reading. And that, but again, that's just the beginning. Dr. Scott.
Just in that same context, I'm going to push the study of African languages. There is no college or university in the United States that would dare think of history without some understanding of ancient Greco-Roman culture. The same certainly must be true in relationship to African language, history, and culture.
Thank you all for your presentations, and The World in Africa is by far one of my all-time favorite books. I really appreciated your celebration of it, and I'll get in touch with you later about language and see if we can do some collaboration with that. My question, if you wanted to speak further about maybe the historiography question, and the way in which, for me as a scholar, I look at Bois's work as an expose of the apartheid structure of knowledge, basically, in the academy. Thank you very much. And it hasn't changed at all. That's one of the things we're talking about. When I look, I'm also at work in East Africa, so I was thinking about the East African piece. What he wrote is still ahead of what's going on right now, some of the most critical scholarship. And so it exposes it, but it still needs to be engaged so that we can deconstruct that apartheid. There's literally separate conversations sometimes that are happening. So that was my main thing. And on this question of African names, and I know he said not the class, but I was even thinking about how did Africans have a need to name a continent as opposed to being in the center of the world and knowing that their cultures overspilled what we now think of as a continent. And you know, we're so hung up about it because they were in the middle. Maybe naming a continent and delimiting it is more of a colonial act anyway. So there's hundreds of names for spaces that overlap and are less linear. So that was my secondary comment. So the historiography wants to see here.
Some of the questions that Du Bois asked in the early 1900s are still being asked today. Some of the ideas that he tried to challenge, we are still trying to challenge some of those same ideas. One of the things he writes in the book is to look at Egyptians, for example, and who are Egyptians? Are they African? Are they Europeans? Are they white? Are they black? What are they? And he suggests, for example, that to understand Egypt and its origins, you need to look further to the south as opposed to the north. Well, we're still debating in some circles who Egyptians are today. There's a whole body of European-centered scholarship that completely refuses to accept, for example, that perhaps Egypt, that we need to turn further to the south to understand Egypt. So what I would say is that this historiography is still evolving. There's some of the challenges that he tried to tackle, we're still dealing with it today.
Dr. Benjamin, I appreciate your question. And one of the things that, you know, when I thought about when I heard that, when I hear the, you know, the idea that, well, Africans don't have a term for Africa itself, I sort of agree with the idea. It's not the most important question, but I think there's a model of governance that if we actually unpack it, has a lot of political and ethical value for African people in the world today. If you look at the notion that the ancient Egyptians used, they use a phrase called Jamu Niu Diawu, which is all the peoples of all the lands. The fact that they would actually develop this term, a phrase, and really actually use it, that's not to say that the ancient Egyptians weren't, you know, didn't have a degree of ethnocentrism, but you cannot compare the city-state type of model as opposed to this African mode of production state that Marx insists on calling Asiatic, because, of course, Egypt couldn't be a part of Africa because of ideology. You know, Du Bois sees through that. And it is Du Bois who begins that idea of repatriating that concept. And again, this is important, not just because of Egypt. Kemet, or Egypt, is very important, you know, of course. But if you look at that same model, you see it replicated almost in every major African state. Kanem-Bornu, a Central African ethnic group, sure. But then at the same time, you have some type of representation of other ethnic groups. The same thing goes on in Ghana, Mali, Songhai. And you can't really find the same extremes of ethnocentrism. There are exceptions. I think Songhai is one of the most important of the AMP states, the African mode of production states. After 1591, the Battle of Tondibi, we really wind up here in large numbers after that battle. And once that AMP state dissolves, is destroyed by the Spanish, by the Moroccans, then you have really the fracturing of West Africa into, you know, and the competition, the Mafa really begins hot and heavy. But we have to actually begin to rephrase, to really develop a worldview that can see the similarities between the AMP state and India, Ashoka's state. If we look at that AMP model, which Cheikh Anta Diop, Du Bois begins a little bit, but I think Cheikh Anta Diop did the most to actually really lay that out there. And I think we have to just pick that up in political science and history and in other fields, and I think it'll definitely pay off.
It's getting good.
It's unfortunate my colleague just left, because I wanted to disagree with him that African historiography is evolving. It is not. You either accept an interpretation of African history or you do not. Those Western scholars are still persistent on their thesis that whatever happens to Africa or to African Americans is because of the association with white people. Now, Du Bois' interpretation is to the contrary. So you either, if you accept Du Bois' interpretation, then the history is there. We just need to write it and interpret it that as Du Bois does. When you read Du Bois' works, you find or you feel that he was deeply angry by what had happened to black people as a result of their contact with white people. He was somehow politically correct in carving his words. He was measured sometimes in putting it, but he was very angry, and he wanted to open our eyes to the extent that at no other time in history should we allow such a thing to happen. And I think this is what you get from most of his writings. He tries to open our eyes. He tries to insist that our leaders should be educated to the extent that not only should they debunk all of those myths, they should begin to interpret their own history, what they do according to how they see it.
Thank you, and I will close with a comment from my colleague, Dr. Scott. Reconstructing memory is the only way to stop the violence. Reconstructing memory is the only way to stop the violence. And I would direct your attention to a book by Reland Rabaka, who talks about epistemic apartheid, and he's referencing specifically sociology, but in every discipline, not only Du Bois, but African American scholars have been systematically ignored. It is not by accident. It is systematically ignored for, that we are not present in those books. But I do think that's precisely why our serious reading of Du Bois can't happen in one day. This is just the beginning of this important discussion. I mean, we didn't even approach Nkrumah. We didn't approach, there's so many topics that we didn't talk about his visit to Liberia in 1923. We didn't talk about it really so much. So these discussions are imperative as to recognize that this is just a beginning, that even talking about Du Bois for a year is only scratching the surface. And again, to reiterate, part of the reason we are studying Du Bois as a scholar is because he was impeccable in his research, in that he really, with none of the modern conveniences that we have regarding technology, what would Du Bois do with cut and paste? What would he do with the internet? Seriously? And so without any of the conveniences that we have, he still produced this and amassed this information that is unchanging. The truth is unchanging. How we see it may change, but he left us with a legacy of great intellectual responsibility to restructure the memory, because every generation seems to be more distracted and more conveniently forgetting what those central truths are. So thank you very much for coming. I would say the new deadline for the conference is October 15th, where we commemorate the 50th anniversary of Dr. Du Bois's passing, and bring scholars for the first gathering since 1975 to talk about Du Bois in the one institution where he produced that knowledge. Thank you for coming.
Have you ever did anything with